We got news this week that there was zero economic growth in July. Inflation is still high at 3.8%. And we've just had the highest August borrowing figures in the last 5 years. For every 0.1 percentage point they take off their productivity growth forecast, doesn't sound like much. It adds about 9 billion to the fiscal black hole, or we have the most expensive new nuclear in the world in Britain. Hinkley Point C will be the most expensive nuclear power plant ever built. We're 6 times more expensive than South Korea. We're sort of a quarter more expensive than France, half more expensive than Finland.
Hello and welcome to the IEA podcast. My name is Reem, Ibrahim, and I'm the head of media and Linda Whetstone Scholar here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today I am delighted to be joined by Tom Clougherty, the IEA's Executive Director, and Kristian Niemietz, the IEA's Editorial Director. Today we are going to be discussing the update with the UK economy, the various deals and negotiations that came out of Trump's visit to the UK this week, and of course the 2 political protests that occurred over the last week. Tom, let's start off with the UK economy. We've had various different statistics come out over the last week. We've seen inflation, the debt to GDP ratio, and of course the public sector productivity stuff that the IFS have published. Tell us what's going on.
Yeah, well, it's basically all bad news for the Chancellor and the government. So we do feel like we're repeating ourselves a little bit sometimes. But, we got news this week that there was zero economic growth in July. Inflation is still high at 3.8%. And we've just had the highest August borrowing figures in the last 5 years. So all of these things are pointing in the wrong direction. I think the biggest and most interesting story this week, though, was probably, I think it was in the FT, they were suggesting that the Office for Budget Responsibility was going to downgrade its productivity forecast for its next economic and fiscal outlook. Now, that sounds very dull and technical. Actually, it can have a huge impact because effectively tax revenues and economic growth really depend on that underlying productivity forecast that the OBR makes. Now, quite famously, ever since, pretty much as long as the OBR has been around, they've been forecasting a recovery in productivity. So before the financial crisis, you had productivity growth of about 2% a year, a little bit more. Since then, it's been about 0.5% a year. But the OBR has consistently been saying an uptick is just around the corner. And at the moment, their forecast is about half what it was pre-financial crisis. So they have said, medium, long-run productivity growth about 1.1% per year. That's significantly higher than most private sector forecasters. It's significantly higher than the Bank of England. And so they've been under some pressure. Can they really maintain this fiction that things are about to turn around when there's no real sign of how or why that might happen? Probably at the worst possible time. We're told that they've indicated to the Treasury, we're finally going to downgrade our productivity forecasts. And the reason this matters in terms of fiscal policy and in terms of an upcoming budget is that for every 0.1 percentage point they take off their productivity growth forecast, doesn't sound like much, it adds about 9 billion to the fiscal black hole, or which is to say the gap between meeting the fiscal rules and not meeting the fiscal rules at the end of the forecast window. So if, let's say, they decided to match the Bank of England's productivity forecast, then you're looking at, 36 billion in 28-29 that the Chancellor has to come up with from somewhere if she's going to stick to the fiscal rules, be that from spending cuts, hopefully, or from tax increases, more likely. So I think in a way, right, this productivity growth is at the root of everything when we're talking about economics. And it's strange in a way that this isn't just the only conversation in town because it has such a huge influence on everything else. Really, every policymaker in Britain should just be absolutely obsessed with the question, why has productivity flatlined? What can we do to get it going again? And that is, it's a way of reframing the kind of the growth mission, if you like, more or less the same thing. But that should be front and center of every policy decision. I think when I spoke to John Cochrane for one of our podcasts recently, and that one's coming up soon, he talked about like the Marie Kondo rule, which is something Rob Colville at the CPS has coined as well. Rob has said, does this spark growth? The way Marie Kondo, the kind of clean up your house person, is like, does this bring joy? If not, throw it away. For John Cochrane, it was basically like, does this spark productivity growth? Like that is the yardstick for making policy, or it should be.
Litmus test.
The litmus test. It should be right now. There's one other aspect to this productivity question, which I think has just been in the news today, and it's a new report from the Institute for Fiscal Studies looking more narrowly at public sector productivity. And I hadn't actually twigged this, but at the moment, the government is assuming that productivity growth in the public sector will rise quite dramatically because of civil service reforms and efficiency drives and so on in Whitehall. They assume basically that productivity growth in the public sector is going to grow at 4 times the rate it did between 1997 and 2019 over the next few years. This actually, again, is essential to the government's fiscal plans. Now, if productivity growth in the public sector remains flat, which I think there's a pretty good chance of, given recent history. In fact, I mean, you've seen declines in parts of the public sector. If it stays flat, that alone by itself, according to the IFS, is an £18 billion black hole in 2029-30 or 2028-29, whichever one it is. I mean, you add all of this up, I'm starting to feel sorry for Rachel Reeves. But she's made mistakes. She's done policies that I would not have pursued, obviously. But it's just one bit of bad news after another. And it does really begin to feel a bit like a doom loop, that you wonder, how is this government, or really any democratically government, going to break out of it? Because although it can clearly be done, you have to have the political will, you have to have the public acceptance, and I'm not sure either of those things are there at the moment.
Because there wasn't the public acceptance for what they would coin as austerity, right? And that, right, like there wasn't the public acceptance like there was in 2010, I suppose, that there needs to be a period of pain in order for us to get public finances in order. So we're probably going to see tax rises again this year. What do you think that will do to productivity and also to economic growth as a whole? I mean, what I find really interesting is comparing us to other countries, and obviously we always compare the UK to the US, but it's just astonishing to me that they've managed to sort of keep above a 3.5% marker for economic growth. I believe that in the second quarter of this year, which is the most recent growth figures, that they were above 3.5%, and yet we saw no growth in July. I think overall, the 3 months to July was about 0.2%. It's pretty abysmal. Why is it so bad here? And how can you fix that? And why are we going to see tax rises again this year?
Well, I mean, just thinking of America there, for example, I mean, I think there are a couple of things going on in America. First of all, their trend growth rate was higher than ours, sort of pre-financial crisis and everything as well. So although they've ticked down, a lot of Americans are quite disappointed with their recent economic performance, although we might look at it rather enviously. I think the second thing is, obviously the US has massive tech industry, and they really are at the forefront of innovation and growth there. So that's having an effect. I also think that there's a danger when you look at the US that basically they've just been running the economy hot. And that probably they're going to deal with a bout of inflation, or they're just going to build up such big kind of fiscal problems for themselves in the long run, that will eventually kind of course correct and kind of undermine some of that growth. So I don't think everything is rosy in America, although I take their statistics rather than ours, I suppose, although we couldn't run those kinds of deficits and get away with it in this country without a plan to kind of bring the books back into balance. Why is the UK doing so badly? I mean, I think it's a combination of factors. You talked about tax. I think tax is very important. And I think, again, there's a possibility that we just get into a negative feedback loop here, right? Where things are going badly. So, well, first of all, we've got a lot of debt and we're paying a high rate to borrow at the moment compared with a lot of other countries. That by itself is going to widen the deficit. Now, if the economy performs badly, that's going to widen the deficit
The interest
further.
payments are like 10% of total public spending.
Right, exactly. And how do you respond to that? Well, probably if you're a politician, you respond to that by raising taxes. But does raising taxes then actually damage the economy even more? Does it then drive the debt higher still and increase the borrowing costs? And so you can see how you get stuck in this very unhelpful dynamic. And, I think the only real way to break out of that is you have to, first of all, really commit to proper spending restraint, both in the short term. And when I say in the short term, really, if you want to cut spending right now, you have to look at working age benefits and you have to look at public sector pay and employment. By the way, that would be a good way of boosting productivity in the public sector. One little remarked upon factor of the austerity program in the early 2010s is that public sector productivity actually did a lot better than it had done previously because we were reducing the kind of the cost and the resources that we were putting in there compared to the output that was coming out. But you have to also think about the long-term picture, I think. And I think if you do address the long-term picture, which is, of course, about the aging population and the huge fiscal impact that that's going to have, then I suspect you will see some reward from the gilt markets for, being realistic and trying to contain those long-term costs such that it would have some immediate impact as well. But there, you're talking about the triple lock, you're talking about public sector pensions, and, you're talking about kind of health and social care for the elderly. You have to couple that serious commitment and proper plan for fiscal restraint and reducing the state share of GDP with a pro-growth agenda. And that can be tax reform, which could be revenue neutral, by the way. But I think it also needs a lot of regulatory reform. And I don't think anyone listening, if they've listened before, will be surprised to hear me say, I think it's the planning system. I think it's stuff that drives up energy costs. And I think it's stuff that really constrains lending in the banking sector as well. Those are probably the key regulatory areas. Although, frankly, the whole regulatory state in Britain needs a careful review and an overhaul, because I think when you talk about productivity, what is productivity? It's doing more with the same resources or doing more with less resources. And how does that come about? Through innovation. People think innovation is like a scientific breakthrough. You invent something new and fabulous. And sometimes that's right, but sometimes it's just by process improvements. And I think one of the problems with bureaucracy and red tape is that those process improvements don't happen because everyone feels so constrained by the set of rules that they're following. It's just too much trouble to try and do things differently. It's too risky to try and do things differently. And so it doesn't happen.
Let's talk a bit about energy specifically. Is something you brought up, Tom, because I do think it is of interest. And Kristian, I'd be interested in hearing your perspective on this, especially when we're obviously comparing the US to the UK. One thing that does really stand out is how low their energy costs are in comparison to us. But also what's interesting is, and Tom Harwood actually brought this to my attention this week, that the UK government are predicting that we use less energy per person over the next decade or so. So we are expecting to use less energy, even though if we are going to be, sort of in innovation, also technological innovation, we need large data centers that use huge amounts of energy. Why don't we have abundant energy?
Well, through policy choices. That's the thing that we always talk about here. But it really is true that energy production per capita has been declining since 2008, since the Climate Change Act, and quite dramatically so. And even though quite clearly there is no such thing as a low energy rich country. So, of course, there is a cutoff point beyond which, say, countries can get richer without per capita energy consumption production going up further. But we haven't yet found a low energy rich country, a country that manages to be rich at low levels of energy consumption. But let me just get back to the public sector productivity forecasts for a moment, because there, and this is one of those cases, I'd be very suspicious of any forecast that predicts a sudden break in the series and that can't really say why. That can't really say how this is supposed to come about. Like with this supposed increase in public sector productivity that's just around the corner, but nobody can exactly say why this is supposed to happen. Because this is how our colleague Chris Snowden won his bet a few years ago against Jonathan Portes, where Portes wrote this forecast with a few co-authors about how supposedly the relative child poverty rate was supposed to explode, going up to rates that have never been seen in history. And Chris Snowden, he said in betting against that, he didn't even read the forecast. He just said, well, this has never happened. And what has happened on the policy side that is so dramatically different from everything that happened before, that suddenly we're supposed to see relative child poverty rates of, I think the prediction was more than 30%. And where is this supposed to come from? And won the bet quite clearly on that basis, just by looking at historical trends and saying, well, how on earth are we supposed to see such a massive deviation from the historic norm? And when it comes to public sector productivity, well, I mean, I've looked specifically in the past at productivity in the National Health Service, where there is a bit of a pattern. So there hasn't been a period when productivity was exploding. There is no golden age for productivity, but the one time when it really did go up quite visibly was in the early Cameron years, which was, of course, a period of relative restraint, where you had it was spending, the NHS budget was still going up in real terms, but only just about keeping pace with the increase in demand that you can attribute to demographic changes. So just about keeping pace with that, which did mean, it was labeled austerity at the time. I suppose you could call it that in comparison, if you compare it to the Blair Brown years when it was increasing 6%, 7%, 8% in real terms every year. Compared to that, yes, period of relative restraint. That's when you see productivity gains, and when you see when you have the opposite of that, which is what we had in recent years. Massive, unplanned, sudden spending injections, that's when productivity goes down. So we're in a situation where the political mood doesn't allow anything that looks like the Cameron years, right? And that's why I really can't see how we're supposed to see productivity increases specifically in the health service, which is the biggest part now of public spending. Where is this supposed to come from? And even if you could do that, even if you could say, okay, we will just keep the budget constant in real terms. We only make a demographic adjustment. We only adjust for those cost increases that you can specifically attribute to population aging, but nothing beyond that. Okay, yes, then you would see productivity improvements, but also it would not feel to people like the service is doing more than it used to do before. You would keep. So you would have numerical productivity increases. You would read about them in the Financial Times, but that's not something that you would directly experience. And right now we're set for big spending increases. So that can only mean if past trends are anything to go by, if anything, that should mean a decrease in productivity. And then where is the productivity increase in the rest of the public sector? Where's that supposed to come from? They're not doing anything that hasn't been done before. All the changes, that's standard fare.
It is interesting that the predictions came without any real marker of how that was going to happen.
Well, I think
4 times is a huge amount.
Yeah, but I mean, in fairness, they're trying to do a Whitehall efficiency program. I think they're doing something like a 10% across the board cut in administrative budgets in government departments over this period. There are plans, although I've read this week they're not going particularly well, to sort of use AI and data and stuff better in the public sector. So I'm not saying these are good plans that justify such an increase in productivity, but there are attempts being made to do something. So it would be unfair to say they've just sort of fiddled the books to make the numbers add up here. But it's a very ambitious target that probably isn't going to be met, I would guess.
But even then, the problem is, I'm sure if you go back to government reports from 20 or 30 years ago, they will also say, and we will make better use of technology.
Yeah.
Because that's always the case with these 10-year plans in the NHS, where they say we will have big productivity increases. Right now, they're saying it's because we will use AI, and that's not something that you would have read in the Blair years. But back then, it was they're saying, well, we'll use the internet. You always have this in every decade. There's some shiny, glitzy technology, and you get government reports saying, oh, we will use that, and then productivity will go up. But is this really, is the drive to use AI now really so different from the Blair government saying we will use the internet?
Yeah.
It's interesting, I think, because of how, 4 times increased productivity is a huge amount, and it's obviously very ambitious.
Just to be clear, the rate of increase will be 4 times higher than the current rate of increase. Not that productivity will sort of quadruple. Okay, that would be quite amazing. And maybe AI can deliver something like that. People who are bullish about AI, really do think it can be transformative in relatively short order. My guess is that even if it proves transformative in the private sector, for reasons that we're all well aware of, it will probably lag behind in the public one.
Part of the problem maybe reveals sort of a broader problem in which when, if there are promises, not just for productivity, but also for spending restraints, there is no real guarantee that that money will not be required, right? So, and this is sort of the problem with spending cuts and sort of using that in the prediction in the short term. We absolutely need to reduce the size of the state, but it's really about reducing what the government does rather than just slashing budgets. And I suppose this might be a difference between the sort of spending restraints that we saw in the 2010s and what I think that we need to be doing in the long term, which is just actually thinking about what the government does and reducing that in a very different way.
Well, and then there are two stages. And I think we never really got out of stage one in a meaningful way in the 2010s. So you start with just cutting budgets across the board and reducing wages or employment and reducing benefits. And that can take you so far. In a pinch, if you've got to save money this year and next, that's probably how you do it. But for that to be a sustainable program and one that makes real long-term progress in reducing the size of government, you have to ask precisely those questions that you've just outlined. Is this something that the state has to do? Does the state have to do it this way? Is there a private sector alternative? Can we just stop doing it altogether? And that plus looking at the age-related liabilities of the state is sort of the key. And we haven't done that. In fact, in the 2010s, we made the age-related liabilities of the state much worse through the triple lock and other measures. So it was not a coherent agenda in that respect.
Indeed. Let's move on, although it's obviously very related to everything we've just discussed, to Trump's visit to the United Kingdom and the negotiations that came out of that. I mean, I think the most exciting part, and we've sort of discussed nuclear energy and energy abundance and its importance overall already, but the negotiations that have come out will make it easier for US companies to build nuclear power stations in the United Kingdom, which is, I think, a very good thing, although, of course, the details of this deal are yet to be discussed publicly. And, of course, we'll see exactly what that looks like. There are a bunch of companies in the US that are now promising investment in the UK, which, of course, will be of interest, I think, in the long term, just seeing what that looks like. It's obviously not very clear if any of that is actually due to Trump coming to the UK and whether or not the specific negotiations have anything to do with it. But the being positive and being proactive about allowing nuclear power stations to be built in the UK are a good thing. Kristian, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the most promising announcement, the most promising idea that's been floated there is the mutual recognition of regulatory standards, that a nuclear project that's considered safe in the US, that would get approval here as well. I've been wondering for quite some time why we don't do much more regulatory free riding. You could, in a lot of areas, you could say if a particular technology or medicine or whatever, if it's approved in either the EU or the US or Japan or just some place where we generally consider safety standards to be sufficient, why don't we just automatically approve it here as well and say, well, we don't need to have regulatory agencies and approval agencies testing procedures for everything. Of course, there are maybe areas where, say, risk preferences may differ between countries and populations, or where you may have country-specific risks. But for, say, things like technologies and medicines and things like that, where we're really talking about physical properties, biological, chemical properties of a technology, of a product, why not just say, okay, these are the regulatory agencies that we trust. If it's green lighted by any of those, you automatically get approval here, and we just free ride on those.
Yeah,
that is a great idea. Why is that? I've never heard the term regulatory free riding before. Right.
I mean, it's another way of talking about mutual recognition, but I like it. You've coined a good phrase there.
Yeah,
Chris.
it's a great phrase.
I mean, I think this is interesting when it comes to nuclear. I mean, these kind of big bilateral show. It's theatre, really.
Yeah.
It's put on for the press. Is Blackstone going to invest 90 billion in the UK over the next however many years, 10 years or something, because Donald Trump came and stayed at Windsor Castle? No, right? They're doing it because they see maybe some good value investments here. But it's nice to be able to announce these things when you have politicians and the press all gathered together and everything. I think the nuclear story is an interesting one. And actually it ties into something else. I think it was this week. The group Britain Remade did a launch of their policy playbook for cheaper nuclear in Britain. And really, really interesting research, actually, I think, which kind of ties into this question because, they say we have the most expensive new nuclear in the world in Britain. Hinkley Point C will be the most expensive nuclear power plant ever built. We're 6 times more expensive than South Korea. We're sort of a quarter more expensive than France, half more expensive than Finland. And the reason these cost differences matter is that if we're building nuclear at current UK prices, it's going to push up bills. right? It's not going to be a really great thing for energy abundance or anything like that, even if you assume that renewables are getting more expensive. The government expects the cost of renewables to fall. I think it's reasonable to be quite skeptical about that. But even if you assume an upward path for renewables and nuclear at current prices, it doesn't really make any economic sense to do it. Consumers will be worse off. Okay, maybe there are other considerations, energy security and whatever, but that's sort of the core of it. If we could build at Korean prices, or even if we could build at French prices, compared with that pathway for renewables, nuclear looks like a much better deal. Cheaper bills for consumers, more reliable baseload capacity, and everything else. And so, the authors of that report, one of whom I think is Sam Dimitri and Michael Hall are the authors of that report. And it ties into what Kristian was saying. Why do we have to have every nuclear development in the UK be a kind of bespoke development, right? Now, let's say that you want to buy a car. I'm sure that it's possible to find someone somewhere who will make a completely bespoke car for you, a type of car that has never been built before and is specified perfectly to your needs, and maybe the particular terrain you're going to drive it on and everything, right? That can be done. My guess is that's going to be really, really expensive. Whereas if you have something which is tried and tested and mass-produced, it's going to be a lot cheaper. Now, of course, a nuclear power station is a lot more complicated than a car, but the fact is nuclear is not really a new technology, although there are new applications of it. There have been successful and safe nuclear power stations built around the world for many years. Why can you not simply say, as Kristian has just pointed out, this is a design that is cost effective and is clearly safe and reliable, and it's built there. Why don't we build one here as well, instead of having this endless consultation, planning, permitting cycle with all of the objections and all of the judicial reviews? I mean, in a sense, I would just say, if you wanted to simplify this, is there already a nuclear power station there? An active one or a closed one? Okay, sounds like a good site to build a nuclear power station. Is this a kind of nuclear power station which is already in operation somewhere, and is it safe and reliable there? Okay, great. Just do that. Right,
just
and then
copy and paste.
You have standardisation. You can sort of build a pipeline. Financing becomes a lot easier in that perspective. And I think it's just important to bear in mind here, as Britain Remade have pointed out, nuclear energy is actually very safe. Right, and radiation is sort of natural. It's in the background. You get a lot of it if you live in Cornwall because of all the radon rock. Far more than if you live like in a trailer on the grounds of a nuclear power station. This is just not something we should worry so much about. And so there's just no proportionality. There's no cost-benefit analysis at the moment in the regulation of nuclear energy. What I don't want to do here, though, is just sound like a nuclear fanboy, because we're free market economists. We should be thinking not what sounds cool and gee whiz and could we get the government to pay for. It's, what would the market dictate? And, I think sometimes in energy policy, just because of the situation you're in, maybe you do have to kind of second guess the market a little bit because the government is just so involved in all of it. You can't just say, well, let's go straight to a market. But I think longer term, we should be thinking, how do we have a more market-oriented energy system? And then how, is there a mode of nuclear regulation which could make it a big part of that free market energy system? And I'm sort of, maybe skeptical about these big mega projects, because though in theory they could be privately financed, in practice they never have been an entirely private venture. But you look at the new small modular reactors, and that was, I think, a big part of this UK-US agreement, that Rolls-Royce, for example, would be able to roll out some of their SMRs in the US. That shows maybe real promise, because these are small enough and maybe lower risk enough that the private sector can genuinely take them on. And I think with things like AI and data centers, there's actually a strong private sector incentive for big tech companies who do have large mountains of cash on their balance sheet to actually sort of take the lead and get these things established and proven, and then maybe they can scale and they can spread. So I think there's an interesting free market angle on nuclear energy at the moment, which maybe hasn't been there in the past. But we have to get the regulation right.
Yeah, I was just going to say, the nuclear energy, and the reason why it hasn't been built in the UK in the same scale as, say, France, for example, is ultimately a planning problem, right? I mean, this is a planning problem. It's often, in some cases, a NIMBY problem. The restrictions and the fear around the safety of nuclear energy, even though, as you've outlined, Tom, it is so much safer than so many other forms of
Well,
energy.
all true, except the reason France has so many nuclear power stations is because they decided in the 70s, in response to the oil crisis, we're just going to build 1 million nuclear power
and that was a very
stations.
centrally planned,
Centrally
government-led
government
project.
But nonetheless, you don't have to be a nuclear fanboy as such to say that, well, in a market-based setting, we will probably see an energy mix that would be much more heavily biased towards nuclear energy, simply because this is where the regulatory barriers are much more costly than even for other energy types, energy sources, even though they're too high for all of them. Essentially, we need a lot more energy of basically most types, but the regulatory hurdles are clearly disproportionate, and nuclear is particularly heavily penalized, and for no obvious reason. It's not, I never quite understood where this comes from. It's not that this country has a very large and militant anti-nuclear movement, as some other countries have, and where you can explain decisions like that because of the political mood. That's not even the case here. Here, it's
the consequence of the bad planning system.
It is, yes.
Yeah.
Planning and I think just fear of a sort of paranoia about radiation. I mean, it's not wholly a British story. Britain is unique in how bad the situation is on the planning front, but on the regulatory front, this is sort of common to most developed, advanced economies, with a few exceptions. And so, it's really something that maybe it's deep in the mid 20th century psyche.
Indeed. And speaking of France, you were going to talk a little bit about the comparisons and why France is worse.
I won't labour this, but I just think it's interesting. There have been a few stories I've seen this week about the economic situation in France. Obviously, they've lost another prime minister recently. The new one has already been the subject of pre-planned protests over the weekend. And so, look, I mean, it's easy to think, Britain, what a terrible state we're in. But then you look across the channel, and I think we should look across the channel a bit more often, actually. I suppose this is really my point here, that we talk so much about America and, sort of global hegemon, they speak English too, they dominate media, so it's understandable that people are naturally drawn to looking at America and talking about it. But then France is nearby. Historical allies, historical enemies, all of that, sort of same size economy-ish, same size population-ish. And crucially, I think many of the same problems and dynamics we have in our politics and economics, just taken to a slightly more advanced degree. And so part of me wonders if, it's very hard to gaze into a crystal ball and see the future. Can one simply look across the channel and see where Britain ends up without a different policy direction? So, but I mean, in terms of similarities, we've joked about, how many prime ministers we burned through at the tail end of the Tory government. France has had 5 prime ministers in less than 2 years. Just sticking with politics for a second, their centre-left has more or less collapsed. Their centre-right has completely collapsed. They now have a kind of populist, radical, far-right party, call it what you're, very nationalistic. And you have a sort of cosmopolitan, centrist movement under Macron, which is trying to hold the line but desperately struggling to do so. I wrote in a comment piece this week that Britain hasn't balanced a budget since the turn of the millennium. That sounds terrible. France hasn't done it since the 1970s. We're spending 44% of GDP. Government is spending 44% of GDP, 57% there. Our deficit's
57%.
It was in 2023. I think that was the figure I've got there. We've got a 5% deficit. They've got a 6% one. They were generous in their COVID support and they carried it on for way too long. Sounds familiar, as does the fact that they heavily subsidised energy in the wake of the gas price spike. Because, unfortunately, despite having their large fleet of nuclear reactors, most of them were closed for scheduled maintenance or something. And it's not just to turn them back on kind of situation. But the really striking thing about France compared to Britain, and I think this is why it's particularly worth bearing in mind. John Byrne Murdoch in the Financial Times, this is the weekend edition last week, had a fascinating graph of basically the average income of the over 65s compared with the working age population in most countries. And, generally speaking, we know the direction we're heading in. The retired generation are sort of getting richer. The working age population are suffering a long squeeze on wages and living standards. But we're still sort of middle of the pack-ish. France is the only country in the world, and this is unique in their own history as well, where the average over 65 has a higher income than the average working age person. And of course, they retire at 64 in France. Macron had raised the retirement age to 64. A lot of these protests and the political turmoil they're going through is because the left, maybe not just the left, maybe it's a sort of populist thing in general in France, is demanding that be rolled back, that people be allowed to retire earlier. This is completely insane. If anything, I mean, the retirement age, let's face it, it's got to get to 70 pretty quickly, given everything else, and then we need to make other adjustments as well. But I think that we can look at France, we can see some serious similarities, but we can also just see a more advanced state of the same kind of malaise that we have, a more advanced realignment in our politics, and frankly, a more, what's the way to put this? Just a further degree of separation between reality and perception when it comes to fiscal policy. And simply believing that everything will be fine and we can have our cake and eat it too when the numbers say, no, we can't.
Do they run huge deficits as well? I mean, they a huge amount of debt.
Yeah, a huge amount of debt.
They pay a lot.
Yeah, I mean, they pay a lot of tax as well. Much higher tax economy than we are. So
I can't believe how large their level of public spending is in comparison to the private sector.
Yes, that's the largest in the world, together with Belgium.
That is absolutely outrageous. I'm still in shock by that number. That's insane. Because you really, if France is the future of the United Kingdom, then my God, can we please start changing direction and going somewhere else? I mean,
well, we're doing our best on labour regulation to move in their direction as well, aren't we? But it's worth saying, and we've talked about it before, but the Foundation's essay was sort of based on this idea that France, for all of its problems, terrible tax system, huge government, problem with an ageing population, labour laws, they still perform about as well as we do, or even better economically in the grand scheme of things. The argument there was because they're better on energy, because they're better on housing, and because they're better on infrastructure. You can take that argument too far, but there's something compelling about it. And, I don't want us to turn into France. Far from it. Maybe we could learn from the things that France gets right, and we could also learn from the things that they're doing, which are a bit like what we're doing, but worse, and see the situations that they're getting into and the impossibility of their politics. And maybe just the sort of the level of anger and discord in the population as well, and think we don't want to go there.
No, we definitely don't. We almost
I do want to go
the France is the French.
In some ways we do. We don't want to be there. We want to be more YIMBY, and that's what they get right. So I was on a podcast a few weeks ago organized by the University of Roehampton, where that was the opening question to me. The interviewer or podcast host said, well, look, you call yourself a free market economist. You think the market gets everything right. Look at France. They do everything you don't want. And okay, they're not a role model, poster boy economy, but they're nonetheless no worse off overall in aggregate terms than Britain is. That completely destroys your argument. And I said, well, they do get a few things right on the Foundation side. Their housing stock is about 7 million larger than the British one. And for infrastructure, energy, I can't remember the figures now, but they produce vastly more energy and have a much bigger infrastructure road network. They do far better when it comes to, just the supply of the key input factors where it's really just about permitting stuff to happen. And they allow wealth creation on that basis and destroy it from there. But at least they have that luxury that they permit a lot of activity and then over-regulate and over-tax it. And that's why they are not richer than they are, but also why they're not poorer than Britain, even though if you go purely by the Econ 101 textbook, you would expect them to be poorer. But that was the comparison. And the problem is always just there is a distinct possibility that we adopt the worst bits of the French socio-economic model, that the larger welfare state, the more regulated, particularly labor markets, product markets as well, without adopting the YIMBY aspects, and then you would have really the worst of all worlds, and that is to a small degree already happening. So it's not that we're getting French labor laws, even with the Employment Rights Bill. It's not that rental market regulation or all of that is going to be at the same level as France. But there is this shift in the public mood that we had. So when we had all the anti-austerity marches here about 10 years ago, there was still a general sense here that, well, by and large, the fiscal situation is what it is, and something has to give. And most people would have accepted that you can't just that just by protesting against it, just by marching through Westminster, you are not going to magic fiscal resources into existence. And so this argument that austerity is just a political choice, that spending restraints is just driven by basically bad people who hate the poor, that didn't really catch on here in the way it always catches on in France. That always seems to work. If somebody says, well, we don't need any increase in the retirement age, this is all a lie told by politicians, they always manage to mobilize massive protests on that basis, on the basis of rhetoric of that kind. And in their case, protests really do mean, I sometimes travel through Paris when I visit my family, take a Eurostar to Paris and then a long distance train from there. When I read something about pension reform in France, I immediately change travel plans because I know that they're going to shut down Paris. There you really notice the difference, whereas when you get something like that here, well, you wouldn't adjust your travel plans on that basis.
That's hilarious. Yeah, it's so interesting, I think, because, of course, I mean, the comparisons with Europe in general, I think, are interesting. I mean, you do it a lot with the healthcare. There are a lot of positives to look across the pond. The European continent tends to do healthcare a bit better than the UK.
Yeah, even there, I prefer the French system. It's not exactly the system I would want, but I prefer it if I could somehow press a button and replace the NHS with their system. I would absolutely do it.
It would at least be an improvement. Tom and Kristian, thank you very much for joining me today. I thought that was really interesting. And thank you to all of you for watching and listening. If you want to learn more about the IEA and our work, then do check out insider.iea.org.uk.